Today we're going to be talking about eligibility for the Public Vocational Rehabilitation Program, and this is going to be one of several presentations that we have. First of all, as kind of a background to this discussion, I have the first slide that talks about disability in the United States, and that with people who have a disability, the statistics indicate that less than a third are employed, and of course there are others who are underemployed or only employed on a part-time basis. In addition to having a disability, many are individuals who have different types of social disadvantages. And persons with disabilities certainly, as we've talked, have the right to live independently, make choices, contribute to society, be involved in meaningful careers, and all that certainly would lead to having high levels of quality of life. And then full inclusion and integration into society, as we've talked, involves economic, political, social, cultural, and educational involvement. And as we know, the purpose of the Vocational Rehabilitation Program is to empower individuals with disabilities to maximize employment, achieve economic self-sufficiency and independence, and along with that goes the quality of life issues, have full inclusion and integration. And in the public rehabilitation program, as we know, the priority for service is to provide services to those with the most severe or most significant disabilities. And some of the other things that we're involved in is to making sure that occurs is that we use what used to be known as similar benefits, now comparable benefits, and that would be using as many resources as we can identify the consumer is eligible for, so that we partner with other organizations, which can mean worker compensation or Medicaid, or it can include Social Security disability, other sources that the consumer has access to in terms of supports. And we also, as part of our process, want to ensure that individuals achieve not only a positive employment outcome, but that the outcome is one that meets the abilities of the person, is challenging to the person, and provides a quality employment outcome. In the vocational rehabilitation system, we provide services first by assessing the individual, as we've talked, by doing career exploration. We look at making sure that people who provide services are qualified rehabilitation counselors, and the rehabilitation counselor in making eligibility determinations can rely upon things such as existing information that may exist, hospital records, school records, medical records, and so forth, that we can obtain additional information by sending the person out for various evaluations. Evaluations can include vocational evaluations to determine a person's academic abilities, interests, dexterity levels, and so forth, aptitude levels. Psychological evaluations to determine if there are any mental health issues present which might need to be addressed, and medical evaluations to determine a person's level of physical functioning and ability. We also can rely upon significant others, and we can rely upon the self-report of the person in terms of being able to make a determination as to eligibility. And we would consider all of these results in combination with the consumer, and what we want to do is to partner with the consumer so that the consumer can make an informed choice with regard to rehabilitation services. And in doing so, we would describe for the consumer what we believe would be the substantial or important issues that the consumer needs to address. And with regard to services that we provide in terms of a rehabilitation plan, once we get to that point, these can include assessment services, these can include counseling and guidance, referral to other agencies. We can provide medical and psychological support services that used to be known as restoration. We can provide services for training. We can provide, and that can be technical college training, community college training, and perhaps in some instances it can even mean 4-year college training. We can also provide maintenance and transportation support. As needed, we provide interpreter services, transition services for transition. We provide scribes and readers. We can provide personal assistance, assistive technology, which is certainly very important. We also can provide supported employment as needed, and we can provide job placement services. The rehabilitation counselor has to have knowledge of disability laws, accessibility, technology, employers, and the job market, the labor market, hiring practices, as well as related career development issues, and be able to understand job modifications, be able to do job analyses. We also have to be familiar with community resources in terms of community facilities, training programs, employment resources, things such as the one-stop centers and programs that are available through one-stop programs. And also, I skipped on this slide on purpose, as I said before, the notion of having people make informed choices based upon the information that we provide. Also, rehabilitation professionals will at times provide what I refer to as employability skill development, which I'm going to get to in the next slide. The counselor has to have experience with employers, as I said, understanding the job market, understanding how jobs are performed, and much of that is discussed in the job and described in the job placement class. Networking is very important. Working with individuals with disabilities to help individuals move through the rehabilitation system. Working in transition. When we look at younger individuals, looking at transition from school to work, as well as transition to various educational programs. We work with other rehabilitation providers, rehabilitation facilities, community rehabilitation agencies, training programs, other healthcare providers, and other community resources and support systems that are available to the consumer. We might work in some cases with local community leaders. There might be instances where we're working with local community-based programs, educational programs, various training programs, and we need to, when available, work with consumer groups, as well as I was saying, kind of to summarize some of this, look at various types of workplace supports and accommodations that the consumer might benefit from. We also would do employability, as what I refer to, employability skill development, in which case we would do things such as assisting the person with resume writing, interviewing techniques, job search strategies, as well as being able to understand grooming issues, and be able to go out and be able to identify and locate employment. With regard to more specific areas of eligibility, eligibility can vary depending upon whether we're looking at public or private rehabilitation programs, the Veterans Administration's various state-level programs. As we've said in prior discussions, the state-federal rehabilitation program is an eligibility-based program. A person has to meet the eligibility criteria. A program such as worker compensation, which would be in the private sector under state law, would be an entitlement program where someone who has a work injury, no matter the severity of the injury, but as long as it's a documented injury based upon the definition of disability and the definition of injury in the particular state, is automatically eligible for services. The same can be said about the Veterans Administration programs, these being entitlement programs. A person is entitled to the various services offered by the VA based upon being in the military and completing a military tour of duty and receiving typically an honorable discharge. Most eligibility is done using various types of eligibility worksheets, and in another discussion we are going to go into the VR eligibility worksheet. As you know, just to summarize, the basic criteria for eligibility for rehabilitation services is that a person must have a physical, mental, or learning or mental disability, intellectual disability. The person must be able to, must need vocational rehabilitation services, and does the person have a barrier to employment, and can the person benefit from rehabilitation services in terms of employment and or independent living. So the basic criteria, as you can see, is on this slide: the presence of the physical or mental or learning or intellectual impairment, the substantial barrier that impairment poses to employment, and the question of whether the person can benefit from services in terms of employment that we would have to offer. And then another question we need to answer is, does the person have a significant disability requiring vocational rehabilitation services? And in doing this, we look at functional areas of functioning, of ability, including work skills, work tolerance, self-care, self-direction, mobility, interpersonal skills, and communication. And we examine those, and the worksheets that we'll be looking at ask us to evaluate those factors, those criteria. And then we make a determination as to whether the person has a significant disability, and a person is presumed eligible and has a significant disability if the individual is receiving SSI, Supplemental Security Income, or SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. A person is automatically eligible. Just again for review, the SSI program is based upon individuals who have not been employed in the competitive job market and have not paid into the Social Security system and have resources less than a very minimal amount. The SSI system is based upon a person having paid into the Social Security system and is found to be unable to perform a significant number of jobs which exist in the regional, state, or national economies. And that's because of a disability or a combination of disability and the resultant limitations that arise from that disability. We have to look at significance and determining most significant of disability, and this can include looking at whether the person requires long-term services such as personal care attendance or supported employment, and we have to look at whether the person has limitations in one or more major life functions. I said one or more. A person has to have limitations. Each state is going to be a little different in this regard, and I would say that the limitations in terms of function are a determination that the counselor makes, and that's based upon the limitation areas are based upon what I said in criteria 2 previously. I'll go back to that, which is limitations in work skills, work tolerance, self-care, self-direction, mobility, interpersonal skills, communication, and the counselor makes that determination, and the number of limitations and significant limitations the person has helps to determine whether the individual meets the criteria of having a severe and or a significant disability. I think as time has gone on since 1973, we have moved from the concept of having a severe disability to having a significant disability, because we're trying to even make determinations within the criteria of severe, who is the most severe in terms of having a disability. And that's particularly important when we're not going to be able to serve all consumers. So we have priority categories in terms of severity of disability. As I said before, the most significant disability would be a person who has 4 or more limitations, or limitations in 4 or more areas. We look at next would be limitations in terms of 3 areas, 2 areas, 1 area, and then if a person has no limitations, then they would not be significantly disabled and probably would not be eligible for rehabilitation services. So this has been just a general introduction to the concept of eligibility. I am going to go into more detail with this in a video lecture that I'll be making, but this gives you kind of an overview of background and some of the issues about general eligibility issues and general functional limitation issues.